On the morning of the funeral, my daughter looked at me across the crowded hallway and said, loud enough for others to hear, "You shouldn't even be here." No hesitation, no tremor in her voice, only the cold finality of rejection. It wasn't whispered in shame, it wasn't softened by grief. It was a blade dressed as words, and it cut deeper than silence ever could. For a moment, the world around me blurred. The flowers, the hushed conversations, the black coats moving past like shadows. I stood frozen, not because I didn't understand her meaning, but because I did. A daughter speaking to her father, erasing him as though he were an intruder at his own wife's farewell. I felt the air leave my chest in a rush, the weight of years, the birthdays I never missed, the nights I carried her asleep from the car to her bed, the sacrifices she never saw. All of it collapsed in that instant. In her eyes, none of it mattered. She wanted me gone, invisible, erased from the story before it could even be told. She didn't look away when she said it. Her face held a certainty that told me this wasn't anger born in a moment. This had been rehearsed, prepared, sharpened for a day like this. And the cruelty of it wasn't that she wanted me absent. It was that she believed she had the right to decide it. I stood in the doorway, my hands shaking, but my voice never rose. The hallway felt smaller, tighter, as though every wall had conspired to press me out. People moved past us, pretending not to hear, but I knew they had. Shame burned on my skin, hotter than grief. And yet I stayed rooted where I was, because beneath the sting of her words, something deeper stirred. She believed she knew the story, believed she held the power to lock me outside the door of my own life. But the truth was written elsewhere, in ink she hadn't seen, in a document she didn't expect. Her certainty was a mask, but I already knew the moment was coming when it would be torn away. Still, in that first instant, when her words hung in the air like smoke, all I felt was the collapse of a bond I thought unbreakable. A daughter, cutting her father not with distance, but with the kind of cruelty that doesn't ask for forgiveness, because it doesn't believe forgiveness is owed. And though I stood silent, my heart answered back in a whisper only I could hear. One day you'll understand why I am here. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something similar ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to you. And now, let's continue. The table was longer than I remembered, stretching like a line drawn to divide me from the rest. Candles flickered in polished holders, the light soft and warm on faces that no longer turned toward me. My chair stood at the end, not pulled out for me, not waiting with welcome. It was a place I took on my own, dragging wood against wood, the sound sharp and unwelcome in a room that wanted me silent. As I sat, the air shifted, plates clinked, hands moved, food was served, but not to me. Dishes were passed from one hand to another, each skipping the space in front of me as though my presence carried a shadow no one wished to touch. They filled their glasses. They laughed with restraint. They nodded to one another, and I sat in the space that had once been mine, now treated as foreign ground. The chair creaked beneath me, the sound louder than it should have been, as though it wanted to betray me, to announce that I did not belong. I shifted once, then stilled, aware that even the smallest movement drew eyes that did not want to linger, but could not help but judge. Their silence toward me was not accidental. It was chosen, a wall of avoidance built stone by stone, smile by smile, each one angled toward anyone but me. I looked at my hands resting on the table. They bore the memory of labor, of sacrifices that had built the very walls around us, the roof above us. Hands that had carried and lifted, protected and provided, now left idle, waiting for a plate that would never be offered. My fork sat untouched. The space before me remained bare, as if I had never existed. Conversations rose like tides around me, voices weaving stories and questions, laughter pushed forward with effort, and yet every word was built with careful scaffolding, ensuring none of it touched me. I was there, but I was not. Present, but erased. I studied their faces, familiar and yet strangers now. My daughter, speaking with her chin lifted, her eyes never once brushing mine. My grandchildren, glancing at me in quick, nervous flickers before looking back down at their plates, learning too quickly the language of exclusion, and the others, complicit by silence, eating as though this division was natural, as though the emptying of my place was as ordinary as the passing of bread. Each moment was a weight pressing down on my chest, a reminder that exile is not always made of distance. It is made of closeness twisted into rejection. I was near enough to hear every laugh, near enough to see every bite, but far enough to know I was no longer part of the circle. And in that distance, in that cruel closeness, the ache deepened. I did not speak. Words would have broken like glass in my mouth, sharp and useless. I simply sat, holding the silence, holding the humiliation, holding the memory of what this table once meant. And the more I held it, the more I understood. This wasn't a mistake, wasn't a lapse in manners. This was the new law of the house. The chair I sat in had become a warning, a relic, a place reserved for those who were no longer wanted but not yet gone. And yet even in that emptiness, beneath the cold, beneath the exile, I felt the quiet stirring of something else. They had taken my seat in laughter, in conversation, in belonging, but the truth, the justice none of them knew was coming, sat silently with me. Not on a plate, not in a glass, but sealed in words they had not yet heard, in ink they had not yet seen. The will waited, patient, steady, the voice of the one they could not erase. The chair beneath me groaned again as if to say, for now, this is exile, but not forever. The house still carried the shape of my hands. Every corner knew my touch. Every wall remembered the sweat it had cost me to raise them. I could walk through the hallway with my eyes closed and still feel the grain of the wood I had chosen, the weight of the beams I had lifted, the careful decisions made when this place was nothing but dirt and silence. And yet, as I moved now through those same rooms, it was not warmth that followed me, but a chill, the kind that presses against your spine when you realize you are not welcome where you stand. They did not shout, they did not push, they did not bar the doors. Instead, they let their absence of acknowledgment speak louder. Footsteps faded when I entered, voices lowered, conversations cut short, laughter tucked away like contraband. The air changed when I appeared, as though the walls themselves had decided to close me out. I was not father, not grandfather, not host. I was a presence to endure, a figure hovering where no figure should be, like a shadow they pretended not to notice but secretly wished gone. I would sit in the living room, in the chair that had once been mine, the one positioned where I could watch both the fire and the family. But now it seemed smaller, colder, as if the cushion had grown stiff from disuse. They filled the room with their words and their movements, weaving around me as though I were not flesh and bone, but smoke drifting in a place that no longer claimed me. My words, when I attempted them, floated into the air and died there, unanswered, like echoes in a house abandoned. Children played in corners I had built for them, their toys scattering across floors I had laid with my own hands. But when they looked up, their eyes were uncertain, taking their cue from the glances their parents gave me, glances that dismissed me before I could speak. Even in their youth, they understood something was wrong, that I was not to be welcomed in the same way as the others. And so, they carried their laughter elsewhere, leaving me in silence, broken only by the tick of a clock I had hung decades ago. The photographs on the walls were my undoing. Frames filled with smiles, with birthdays, with celebrations where I had once stood at the center. Now, when I looked at them, I could almost feel the absence being written over the memories, as though each face leaned a little away from me, each image declaring, "Those days are gone." I was no longer part of the living story of this house, only a faded chapter they wished to skim over. And yet the cruelest part was this. I had built it. Every brick, every nail, every hinge was mine. I had carved this space out of nothing, had made it into shelter, into sanctuary. It was supposed to be a place where my name could rest, where my presence could linger not as a ghost, but as foundation. But they treated me as though I were haunting it, as though my footsteps disturbed the balance, as though my existence cracked the walls. I moved quietly through the halls, not because I wished to, but because I learned that my noise was unwelcome. And in that quiet I began to feel it too, that sense of being both there and not there, of breathing but not belonging, of touching what once was mine, but feeling as though it already belonged to someone else. I was a ghost in the house I had built, and no exorcism was needed. They had already decided to forget me. But the irony haunted them instead. The foundation of the home did not belong to their rejection. It belonged to the one who laid it, to the one they tried to erase. And though they might treat me as invisible, the truth sat waiting, heavy and unyielding, written in words they had yet to confront. The walls did not forget me, and one day, neither would they. They came in black coats and hushed voices, neighbors and acquaintances who had known us for years. Some had eaten at our table, some had borrowed tools from my hands, some had watched my children grow. Their eyes carried the weight of condolences, heavy but sincere, the kind that seek to offer comfort by acknowledging the loss. I should have spoken. I should have been the one to thank them, to say yes. She was the light of my life, yes. I will miss her more than breath itself. But each time their eyes turned to me, searching for words, my daughter's voice leapt first. She answered with polished phrases, phrases rehearsed to sound steady. She told them we were coping, though she never looked at me when she said it. She told them the family was grateful, though she placed herself at its center, as though I were a distant relative who had wandered in out of duty. Her voice was smooth, unbroken, carefully composed, and it left no space for mine. I opened my mouth once, twice, but her words pressed over mine, drowning them before they could rise. They looked at her as though she were the rightful speaker, the keeper of memory. And me? I became an object in the corner of their gaze, present but mute. I shook hands, nodded, pressed lips into a smile that felt more like a wound. And all the while, something inside me cracked. This was not grief alone, this was burial before death. To be standing there, breathing, feeling the ache of loss sharper than anyone else could imagine, and yet treated as though I had no right to claim it. What stung most was not that she spoke. It was how she spoke over me, as if my silence was not my own choice, but proof that I had nothing worth saying, as if my grief was too small to name, too fragile to be trusted. And the neighbors, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps out of discomfort, accepted it. They nodded to her. They offered her their sympathies. And when their eyes glanced briefly toward me, it was only with the pity one reserves for someone already slipping into irrelevance. The shame pressed heavy against my chest. My wife was gone, my partner in everything, and now, in the very hour that should have united us, my daughter severed me from the morning, as though I were unfit to carry it. I felt as though the earth had already covered me, as though I were watching my own absence being rehearsed before it ever arrived. Alive, but treated like someone already buried beneath the weight of time and dismissal. I wanted to shout, to stand tall, to claim my place in front of all of them, to remind them that before she was my daughter's mother, she was my wife, that it was with me she had built a life, that it was beside me she had fought and laughed and endured, but the weight of years pressed me still, and I knew that shouting would only feed her certainty, would only make me seem smaller. And so I endured, sitting in my silence while my daughter arranged the image she wanted the world to see. But even as I felt erased, a faint ember burned low in my chest, because I knew something she did not. Her words could silence me here, in front of neighbors, in front of sympathies that slid past me like water. But there existed a truth she could not speak over, a truth that waited in sealed pages, in ink stronger than her voice. She could cast me out in the eyes of others, she could bury me in shame, but she could not change what was written. And as the condolences faded, as the last neighbor pressed her hand and turned away, I felt it, not triumph, not comfort, but certainty. Her voice was loud, but the will was louder, and when its words rose, there would be no speaking over them. The first time it happened, I told myself it was just an oversight. Families grieve in strange ways, I thought. They lean into the loudest voice because silence frightens them. But then it happened again, and again, until it was no longer accident but routine. Family meetings beginning without me, as though my presence were a burden they could no longer carry. They would gather in the dining room, the table spread not with food, but with papers, folders, clipped documents. My daughter sat at the head, the place once reserved for me, a pen always in her hand, her voice sharpened into something like command. She didn't ask, she directed. She didn't suggest, she decided. Her brothers, her children, even distant cousins leaned in toward her words as though they were law. And when I shifted in my chair, when I opened my mouth to speak, her eyes cut across the table like steel. This isn't for you. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of verdict. I tried once more, leaning forward, reminding them of decisions I had made for this family for decades, sacrifices I had borne so their discussions could even exist. But again, she snapped the phrase out like a door slamming in my face. This isn't for you. Each time she said it, I felt the ground of my authority pulled further away. They did not shout me down. They erased me with silence, with the kind of practiced indifference that hurts more than anger. Her pen scratched across paper, her hand signing where mine should have signed, her voice narrating futures that I had no part in shaping. And the others, though some glanced toward me with unease, none spoke. Their silence was complicity. Their silence was agreement. I watched the shifting of sides like shadows on a wall. Those who had once sought my advice now leaned toward her, nodding when she raised her voice, falling quiet when she paused. She had become the center, and I the ghost that haunted the edge of the room. I was there, breathing, watching, aching, but treated as though I were nothing more than a figure who had overstayed his welcome. And yet, every word she spoke carried an arrogance she couldn't hide. She believed herself untouchable, believed that the pen in her hand was the final authority. But I knew better. I had sat in too many meetings in my life, held too many documents, written too many signatures not to recognize the brittle edge of her confidence. She was gambling on silence, building her authority on the absence of my voice. But silence is not weakness. Silence is waiting. What pained me most was not her tone, not her dismissals, but the way others allowed it. Sons who had once looked at me with respect now dropped their eyes to the table, unwilling to stand between us. Grandchildren who once ran to me for stories now shifted uncomfortably when she cut me off, learning too soon that loyalty was dangerous, that love must be quiet if it contradicted her. I was watching my family fracture, not with shouting or violence, but with a slow, deliberate erasure, each repetition of her phrase hammering me further out of the circle. This isn't for you. It echoed in my mind long after the meetings ended, long after the papers were folded and put away. I would sit alone, staring at my hands, wondering how a father becomes a stranger, how decades of sacrifice can be swept aside with 4 words. But beneath the despair, something harder began to grow, because while she wielded her pen like a weapon, she did not know of the paper that waited quietly, sealed and untouched, carrying a voice stronger than hers, the voice of her mother, the one person she could not silence. She thought she was writing the story of this family now. But in truth, she was only filling empty pages, pages that would soon be overwritten by the will she never expected, the document that would remind her, remind all of them, whose voice still mattered. And so I endured the gatherings, endured the sting of being excluded in my own bloodline, endured her dismissals that came like the tolling of a bell, because I knew the sound that was coming next, a sound she could not stop. The rustle of paper, the reading of names, the truth set free in a room where her voice would finally break. There came a point when the words no longer surprised me. They stung, yes, but they no longer shocked. I had learned to expect them the way one expects the turning of the seasons, predictable, inevitable, as though they had always been meant to arrive. This isn't for you. You shouldn't be here. Variations of the same dismissal, falling from her lips like ashes, marking me over and over until the ache became part of my skin. And yet I did not answer. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I sat in the storm of her authority and let the winds tear at me in silence. Silence, after all, is not emptiness. It is storage. Each time she cut me down, each time she excluded me, I folded the wound and tucked it away, hidden but not forgotten. Like stones in a pocket, they grew heavier with each passing day. And though the weight threatened to bow my shoulders, I carried it. I carried it because I knew endurance is not weakness, it is preparation. There were moments when rage burned hot in my chest, moments when I wanted to slam my fist against the table, to shout until her voice cracked and mine rose above it. But I had lived long enough to know that shouting would only feed her certainty, would only let her point to me as the man she already painted in her mind, out of touch, irrelevant, angry. And so I chose the quieter path, the harder one. I swallowed my words, not because I lacked them, but because I knew their time would come when the silence broke open on its own. At night, when the house settled into uneasy quiet, I would sit in the dark and feel the heaviness of those stones. One for each humiliation, one for each interruption, one for each time she turned family against me with her pen and her voice. I could feel their edges, sharp, jagged, pressing into the tender places of memory. And yet I did not throw them away. I let them remain, because each one was proof. Proof of what she had done, proof of what I had endured, proof of the justice that waited ahead, the justice she could not yet see. My endurance became its own kind of rebellion. To still be there when she wanted me gone, to remain calm when she expected me to break, to exist quietly in the spaces she tried to erase me from. She wanted absence, but I gave her presence. She wanted noise, but I gave her silence. And silence, when carried long enough, becomes heavier than any word. Sometimes I would catch the faintest flicker of unease in her eyes when I did not rise to her bait. When she spat her lines and I did not react, when she tried to corner me with authority and I simply sat unshaken, her confidence faltered for just a moment. Because power thrives on resistance. It feeds on arguments, on visible wounds. But silence leaves it starving. Silence is a mirror, reflecting back the cruelty of those who try to wield it. I endured, yes, but I endured with purpose. For every dismissal there was an answer waiting in ink. For every stone there was a word written long before her arrogance found its voice. I thought often of my wife then, of her steady hand, her quiet strength, her knowledge that truth need not shout to be heard. She had prepared something stronger than argument. She had left behind a legacy sealed in paper, a verdict time itself could not undo. And so I carried the weight, each stone pressing deeper, shaping me into someone she could not understand. I looked like silence to her, like defeat, but in truth I was a man waiting at the edge of revelation, a man who knew that when the moment arrived I would not need to lift my voice at all. The will would speak for me, and its voice would be louder than her dismissals, heavier than the stones, final in a way her arrogance could never be. In the quiet of those nights, when the house grew still and no voices sought to drown mine out, I returned to her face. Not my daughter's, but her mother's. The woman who had stood beside me through storms and scarcity, through the heavy years when we built this family from nothing but labor and hope. She had been the one who saw me when the world tried to reduce me to my work. She had been the one who reminded me when strength faltered that dignity is not a gift given by others, but a truth carried within. And in the final days, when her breath grew shallow and her hand trembled in mine, she gave me one last promise to keep. Make sure he knows the truth. The words had been faint, pressed between her lips like a secret too sacred to shout, but strong enough to burn into me forever. She had looked at me with eyes that knew her time was ending, but mine was not, and in them I saw her certainty. She trusted me not with wealth, not with possessions, but with truth. And truth, I understood then, is heavier than inheritance. The will was not just paper. It was her voice, extended beyond the grave, written not in ink, but in intent. She had prepared it carefully, quietly, the way she had prepared so many things in our life, folding away sacrifices, preserving dignity, ensuring that when she was gone, her love would not be buried with her. She knew our daughter's hunger for control, knew how easily the living can rewrite the story of the dead to serve their own pride. And so she wrote her voice into permanence, a final safeguard against erasure. When I remembered that promise, the weight in my chest shifted. The stones of humiliation I carried became less like burdens and more like reminders. Each wound my daughter gave me, each silence forced upon me, each moment I was treated as though I were already gone. All of it pressed me back into the memory of her words. Make sure he knows the truth. It was not a plea. It was a command, spoken by the one person whose authority no one in this family could dismiss. Sometimes when I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, I imagined her hand resting over mine again, steady, unshaken. I imagined her smile, that quiet smile she wore when she knew something others did not. And I realized this was her design. She had known it would come to this, had known our daughter's ambition would sharpen into cruelty, had known that I would be pushed to the edges of my own family. And yet she had prepared the answer long before the question was asked. The will was more than a document. It was her final act of protection. It was her way of standing in the room, even after death. Her way of saying, "You may silence him, but you will not silence me. You may erase his place, but you will not erase the truth of who he is." And so as I carried the humiliation, as I bore the exile of my own blood, I also carried her words. They steadied me when despair threatened to pull me under. They reminded me that justice does not always arrive in the heat of argument. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in patience, in a letter sealed and waiting to be read at the precise moment when arrogance thinks itself invincible. I began to endure not for myself, but for her, for the vow I had made beside her hospital bed, when her hand had grown so thin I could feel the fragile bones beneath, for the look in her eyes when she entrusted me with more than memory. She had given me a weapon cloaked in love, a truth written down, undeniable, unchangeable. And no matter how long I sat in silence now, no matter how invisible they tried to make me, I knew one thing with certainty. The day would come when her words would rise again. And when they did, my silence would no longer matter, because her truth would speak louder than all of their dismissals, and the will they thought was just paper would burn through the lies like fire. The day of the reading arrived with a weight that pressed itself into my chest before the sun had even risen. I dressed slowly, not because I lacked strength, but because each button, each fold of fabric felt like armor I was putting on for a battle no one else could see. The walk to the lawyer's office was not long, but every step echoed with years of silence, years of humiliation, years of being told I no longer belonged. And yet, as I placed my hand on the brass handle of that door, I carried something none of them did, the final promise of the woman who had trusted me to hold the truth. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and paper, a scent of order and law, of lives captured and frozen in ink. The family was already there, gathered in stiff chairs, their faces a mixture of practiced grief and restless anticipation. My daughter sat near the head of the long mahogany table, her posture sharp, her confidence radiating like a performance she had rehearsed for weeks. She greeted the others with nods, arranging herself as though she were the rightful heir, not just to possessions, but to authority itself. When her eyes met mine, they narrowed, not in fear, but in irritation, the way one glares at an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. I took my place at the far end of the table, my movements quiet, deliberate. No flourish, no demand for attention. Silence was my weapon now, and I wore it like a cloak. She wanted me to stumble, to protest, to raise my voice so she could silence me again. Instead, I folded my hands and kept my gaze steady, meeting the lawyer's eyes with a calm she could not touch. Papers were arranged before him, thick with significance, thin with patience. He cleared his throat, and the sound settled the room into stillness. All eyes turned forward, but hers burned with certainty. She had built her world on the belief that she was in control, that the stage was hers to command. Even now, as the reading began, I could see the rehearsed smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, the expectation that the words to follow would confirm the story she had been telling everyone, that I was irrelevant, that she was the future, that the past had already been buried with her mother. I sat motionless, but inside my heart beat steady, not with fear, but with anticipation. Because I knew what was written. I knew whose voice was about to rise in this room, whose hand had signed those papers with a strength even illness could not erase. My daughter thought the silence I carried was weakness, but in truth, it was faith. Faith in the ink that waited to speak louder than either of us. The lawyer's voice rolled out like a bell, each word deliberate, each phrase a stone laid carefully upon the last. Names, acknowledgments, formalities, all leading toward the part that mattered. My daughter leaned forward, her pen already in hand as though ready to claim what she believed was hers. Her confidence filled the air, but it was brittle, like glass waiting for the right strike. I did not need to speak. I did not need to move. I only needed to wait, to hold myself steady while time itself shifted the ground beneath her. The stage she thought belonged to her was not hers at all. It never had been. It belonged to the woman whose voice was about to cut through the room with more authority than any living one present. And in that moment, as the pages turned and the silence deepened, I realized something profound. I was not there to fight her. I was there to witness justice, quiet, steady, enduring. Because when the truth is written in ink, no amount of arrogance can erase it. Before the lawyer could draw breath to speak, before the papers could give up their secrets, she leaned across the polished mahogany table, her eyes locked on mine like a hunter sighting prey. Her voice cut through the stillness, colder and sharper than ever before. "You shouldn't even be here." It wasn't said in a whisper, wasn't hidden behind courtesy. It was spoken with the weight of final judgment, as if she had already written my absence into the story of this family, as if she believed a single sentence could erase me entirely. The others shifted in their seats, uneasy, but none spoke against her. Their silence became her shield, their lowered eyes, her approval. And in that moment, she believed herself victorious. The room hers to command, the stage cleared of me. The words struck, but they did not wound me as they once had. Once they would have hollowed me out, left me raw and humiliated, bleeding inside where no one could see. But now I felt something different. Her voice no longer defined me, it exposed her. Every syllable was arrogance, every sharp edge a confession of her fear that perhaps I did belong, that perhaps she could not silence me forever. I sat still, my face unmoving, but inside I felt the presence of her mother like a steady hand on my shoulder. I remembered her last promise, remembered the ink sealed in envelopes waiting patiently to be opened. My daughter thought this table was her throne, but it was already set against her. She believed the lawyer's silence was consent, that the weight of papers before him would confirm her power. But those papers carried a different voice, a voice she had not expected, a voice she could not talk over. The lawyer looked at her with the faintest flicker of irritation, a reminder that even here, even in this room, her confidence was a mask too thin. He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the tension, but she leaned back in her chair with a smirk, as though she had already won, as though nothing written could change the verdict she had declared with her lips. I said nothing. I let her words hang in the air, let them echo off the walls like a verdict spoken too soon. Silence became my armor again, but this time it was not endurance. It was anticipation. I knew what was coming. I knew that her mother's words, preserved in the black and white of the will, would fall into the silence she created and shatter it beyond repair. Her dismissal was meant to bury me once more, to strip me of dignity in front of every witness present. But instead, it became her undoing. Because when arrogance reaches its loudest, justice often waits just one breath away. And I could feel it now. The shift in the air, the weight of inevitability gathering like a storm behind the lawyer's lips. She had spoken her final attempt to erase me, but the ink was already written, the truth already prepared. Her words were nothing more than the last flare of a fire about to be smothered by something greater than her voice. I lowered my eyes for just a moment, not in defeat, but in reverence. I was not here to defend myself. I was here to witness the fulfillment of a promise the rising of a truth that no dismissal could bury. She thought I shouldn't be here, but she was about to learn that I wasn't just here. I was the reason this moment mattered at all. The room fell into a silence so dense it seemed to press against the walls. Even the hum of the air conditioner, the faint ticking of the clock, the rustle of fabric as someone adjusted in their chair, all of it seemed swallowed by the weight of the moment. The lawyer lifted the folder with deliberate care, his fingers slow, as though he understood that within those pages lay not just words but verdicts, the kind that could fracture a family or bind it forever. Each sheet he touched carried a gravity the rest of them didn't feel yet. To them it was routine, a formality, a legal obligation to confirm what they already believed, that she would be named, that her authority would be stamped in ink, that my silence in the months before had been proof of my irrelevance. They leaned back in their chairs with expectation, some with boredom. And at the head, my daughter smirked, confident, rehearsed, certain. She tapped her pen against the table in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, as if she were already signing what was hers, as if the pages were nothing more than the final act of a play she had written herself. But for me, every movement was thunder. The lawyer's throat clearing cracked like a bell. The rustle of paper sliding free echoed like a gavel striking wood, and when he flattened the first page against the table, the sound landed heavy in my chest, heavier than judgment itself. I knew what was coming, and yet I felt the tremor of anticipation run through me. The stones I had carried in silence, the humiliations stored like weights in my pocket, all seemed to shift, readying themselves for release. I kept my eyes steady on the papers, refusing to meet her gaze, because I knew if I saw her smile in that moment, I might falter. She believed the silence was her triumph. She believed the lawyer's careful manner was respect for her, not the gravity of what he held. And so she sat taller, her shoulders square, her confidence spilling over into the room like smoke. The others followed her lead. They glanced at me with pity, with that quiet discomfort that people carry when they've already decided where power lies. They didn't expect me to speak, didn't expect me to matter. To them, I was simply occupying a chair, a shadow in the room, tolerated for appearance's sake. I felt their judgment as strongly as I felt hers, but I let it press down on me, let it push, let it try to bury me deeper. Because I knew something they didn't. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began. His voice was low, steady, the practiced cadence of a man who had done this countless times. But for me, every syllable was monumental, a crack forming in the stone wall my daughter had built around me. With each word, I could sense the shift approaching, though she remained blind to it. She sat with her smirk, her pen, her certainty, as though the ink of the dead could not speak louder than her living arrogance. I felt the room waiting for her name, waiting for the validation of her authority, waiting for me to be erased in formality as I had been erased in practice. But the silence between the lawyer's phrases grew heavier, denser, pressing into her smirk like a hand at her throat. She didn't notice, not yet, but I did. The weight of silence is not emptiness, it is the breath before revelation. And as the pages turned, their sound loud and final, I understood what my wife had done. She had given me a weapon that required no words, no shouting, no struggle, just patience, just presence, just the endurance to sit in silence until her voice, preserved on those pages, rose again to fill the room with a truth no smirk could withstand. And so I sat still, my body quiet, my face unreadable, as the silence thickened and the weight of the words yet unspoken grew too heavy for any of them to carry without shifting in their seats. Only she remained confident, her smirk fixed, blind to the judgment already forming in the air. She thought silence was her ally, but silence belonged to me. The lawyer's voice carried slowly, deliberate, as though he knew the gravity of each syllable. The room leaned forward, expectant, all eyes drawn to the papers in his hands. My daughter's smirk deepened. The corners of her lips pulled taut with the certainty of victory. Her pen tapped once, twice against the polished wood, already rehearsing the signature she believed would seal her control. She was ready for her name to appear, for the validation she thought the law itself would hand her like a crown. But then it came, not her name, mine. The sound of it landed in the room with a force that none of them were prepared for. Executor. The word struck like a hammer, undeniable, final. My name followed it. Written in black and white, steady, clear, carved into the very document she had been so certain belonged to her. For a moment silence broke open into something heavier, shock, disbelief, the sharp intake of breath from those who had already given her their loyalty. Her smirk froze, fractured, and for the first time in months, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. She blinked once, her pen pausing mid-air, the rhythm stilled. The name she had been waiting for, the name she had believed would crown her authority, had not come. Instead, the name she had spent months trying to erase rose from the page like a verdict, undeniable, immovable. Beneficiary. The word followed like a shadow, each syllable cutting deeper into her certainty. The lawyer did not stumble, did not falter. He read with the calm authority of someone bound to truth, not to politics or family games. And as he spoke, my wife's intent poured through him, strong even in absence, her voice written into permanence. She had known this moment would come, and she had chosen her words like weapons. I did not move. I did not smile. I kept my hands folded in front of me, steady as stone, though inside my chest my heart pounded with a quiet thunder. This was not triumph. It was vindication. For months I had carried silence like a burden, endured humiliation like a second skin. But here, in this moment, my endurance revealed its purpose. I had not been erased. I had been waiting. Across the table her face paled, her confidence cracking. She shifted in her chair, adjusting her posture as though she could still salvage authority, but the damage was done. The truth had been spoken, not in argument, not in defense, but in ink. The room that once looked at her as the voice of command now looked toward me, not with pity this time, but with something closer to awe, or perhaps shame for having believed her so easily. Keeper of the promise. That phrase broke her last defense. For it was not only about titles or possessions, it was about trust, her mother's trust. The woman she had claimed to grieve, the woman whose memory she had wrapped around herself as justification for her authority, had not chosen her. She had chosen me, and no dismissal, no smirk, no sharp-edged words could undo that truth. I sat in that silence, no longer buried, no longer erased. For the first time, it was not me who carried the weight of being unwanted. It was her. The silence she had used as her weapon now turned against her, pressing down on her shoulders, choking the certainty from her throat. She could not speak over this. She could not dismiss it. My name had appeared, and with it, the truth she had spent months trying to deny. And in that moment, I felt my wife beside me, her promise fulfilled, her voice alive again through the words she had left behind. The will was not ink alone. It was her intent, her justice, her love carved into the permanence of paper. And now, finally it spoke. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. The silence that followed was not like the silence I had carried. It was heavier, suffocating, the kind that comes when the ground beneath you cracks open and there is nothing to stand on. Her pen slipped from her hand, the sharp click of it striking the polished wood louder than any outburst she could have made. Her fingers trembled where they lay against the table, reaching for something, authority, composure, control, that was no longer hers to hold. For weeks, months even, she had rehearsed this moment. I could see it now in the way her eyes darted, searching for the script she had memorized, the performance she had crafted. She had planned the speeches, the smiles, the declarations she would make once the lawyer's voice confirmed her power. She had imagined the nods of approval, the weight of signatures sliding across the page beneath her hand. She had built an entire world upon the belief that this reading would crown her the center of everything. And yet, with a single name, with a single designation written in ink she had never touched, it all collapsed into ash. Her mouth moved as though words might still form, but no sound escaped. She was not just silenced, she was undone. Her certainty, once so solid, now melted into panic, barely restrained behind her wide eyes. She stared at the lawyer, then at the pages, then at me, as if searching for some error. some misprint, some possibility that the universe had conspired against her. But the truth was immovable. It was written, witnessed, sealed. It existed, undeniable and final. The others shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty faltering in the face of revelation. Some glanced toward me, hesitant, as though seeing me for the first time, not as a shadow, not as a ghost, but as the man whose name stood where hers had not. Their silence no longer felt like complicity. It felt like recognition. And in that recognition, her power dissolved. She had fed on their agreement, their willingness to let her voice stand as law. But now, with her hands trembling and her face drained of certainty, they could no longer pretend. I watched her carefully, not with glee, not with vengeance, but with something deeper, a quiet sorrow. This was my daughter, the child I had carried, the child I had once sworn to protect. And yet the woman before me was unrecognizable, broken not by cruelty inflicted upon her, but by her own arrogance meeting the truth it could not overcome. She had believed she could control everything, even memory, even legacy. But her mother's will had slipped past her hands, preserved beyond her reach, waiting for this moment to rise. Her speeches, those polished, practiced phrases she had wielded at neighbors, at family meetings, at me, now lay shattered in her throat. She had built them like walls to keep me out, and yet here, in the lawyer's office, it was those very walls that collapsed upon her. Her silence was not the silence of control, but the silence of defeat, a silence that exposed her naked in front of the very people she had tried to impress. I did not move. I did not speak. To comfort her would have been false. To scold her would have been cruel. Instead, I simply sat in the stillness, letting her face tell the story she could not. For all her dismissals, all her certainty, she had never expected this will to exist. She had believed herself the only author of the family's future, but now she realized too late that her mother had written her own ending, and it was not the one she had imagined. Her lips pressed shut at last, her eyes cast down, her shoulders heavy with the shame of having been so wrong. And in that moment, I saw not just her arrogance broken, but her certainty unravel into something rawer, fear perhaps, or the fragile recognition that truth cannot be silenced forever. Her face had fallen, and with it, the false empire she had built. And though the wound she had carved into me would never fully heal, I knew one thing with certainty. Justice had begun its work, and there was no turning it back. The lawyer's voice shifted as his eyes fell to the next lines, and in that moment the room no longer belonged to him or to me or even to my daughter. It belonged to her, the woman who was gone in body but alive in these words, words she had chosen with care, words she had set aside not to divide but to reveal. His tone softened, almost reverent, as though he too felt the weight of her presence in the room. And then, like a whisper carried across time, her voice rose again through him. To the one who stood beside me when no one else did, I leave what cannot be stolen, dignity, memory, home. The air broke open. For a heartbeat no one moved. It was as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen, as if the years of labor and love that built this family shifted in their foundations to echo her truth. I felt her in that instant, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as something alive, something undeniable, sitting beside me the way she had in life, her hand steady over mine. She was speaking not just to me, but for me, cutting through every dismissal, every smirk, every attempt to erase my place. My daughter's face crumbled further, her eyes glassy, her lips pressing together in a desperate attempt to remain unmoved. But she could not stop it, because these were not my words, they were her mother's. The one voice she had tried to claim as her own grief, her own legacy, had chosen to speak with me instead. And there is no defense against the truth of the departed. No argument can rise against the final words of someone whose absence fills the room heavier than presence ever did. I sat in silence, but inside me something shifted. For months I had carried humiliation like stones in my chest, endured exile at my own table, endured the sharp cruelty of a daughter who believed she could write me out of existence. But now, as the lawyer read those words, the stones lifted. They fell away, one by one, replaced with the steady flame of vindication. My wife had seen, my wife had known, and in her last act she had given me back what no dismissal could take: my place, my dignity, my truth. Dignity, memory, home. She had named the three things that mattered most, things that could not be measured in property or accounts, things that could not be signed away by arrogance. These were the treasures she left to me, treasures invisible to those who only sought power. And as her words sank into the air, I saw the shift in the eyes around the table. Those who had once pitied me now looked with something different: recognition, even shame. Because they understood now. They had been watching the wrong figure, listening to the wrong voice. The silence I had carried was not weakness, it was loyalty. And her words had made it visible. My daughter's hands curled into fists against the table, her knuckles pale. She tried to look defiant, tried to cling to her performance, but there was nothing left to hold. Her mother's voice had undone her. It had chosen me, not her. And no amount of protest, no clever phrase, no icy dismissal could overwrite the final truth. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words linger in me, letting them fill the hollow places that months of rejection had carved. It was not triumph I felt. It was not revenge. It was something quieter, deeper. The peace of knowing I had not been mistaken, that love and loyalty had not been wasted, that silence had not been endured in vain. My wife's voice had returned to lift me, and in doing so had broken the chains my daughter tried so hard to bind me with. When I opened my eyes again, the lawyer's gaze met mine briefly, as though he too understood the sacredness of what he had just spoken. And I sat there, no longer erased, no longer the ghost in the corner, but restored, not by my own hand, but by hers. In the end, it was her voice, not mine, that destroyed the lies. And though she was gone, she had spoken louder than all of us combined. The air changed the moment her words finished echoing through the room. It was subtle at first, like the faint shift of wind before a storm, but then it spread, filling every corner, every breath. I felt it move across the faces around the table, the grandchildren who had been taught to look past me, the sons who had bowed to her authority, the cousins who had sat in quiet compliance. Their eyes no longer clung to her. One by one they turned, not toward the polished performance she had tried to command, but toward me. For so long I had been invisible. I had sat in silence while conversations leapt over me like stones skipped across water, my presence tolerated but never acknowledged. They had learned to avert their gaze, to look at her when they wanted answers, to treat me as though my chair at the table was a courtesy, not a right. But now, the weight of their attention pressed against me, not as pity, not as dismissal, but as recognition. The truth had been spoken, and it had rearranged the air in the room. The silence was no longer mine to carry. It was hers. Heavy, humiliating, suffocating. She sat stiff, her shoulders squared in the posture of defiance, but her face betrayed her. The smirk that had once been her shield was gone, leaving only the pallor of shock, and the tremble of someone who had lost ground they believed unshakable. The pen that had clicked so confidently in her hand now lay abandoned on the table, a symbol of authority stripped away. I did not gloat. I did not move to strike her with words she could never answer. I only sat, steady as I had always sat, the endurance of months crystallizing now into a quiet dignity that needed no defense. The room itself bore witness for me. The lawyer's voice, the document in his hands, the eyes of those who had turned, all of it shouted louder than any speech I could give. For her, the silence grew unbearable. I could see it in the restless tapping of her foot beneath the table, in the way her fingers twitched as if reaching for a script that no longer existed. She had built her empire on noise, on performance, on the control of every conversation. Without her voice to dominate, she was left with nothing but the crushing weight of her mother's words. And that silence, my silence, once used to cage me, now pressed down on her, humiliating, unrelenting. It was in that moment that the shift became permanent. She was no longer the center. no longer the voice that guided the room. She was diminished, stripped of the illusion she had clung to. And I, the man she had tried to erase, sat in the place her mother had left for me, not just in the will, but in truth. I felt no triumph, only a deep, steady release, as if chains had been loosened from around my chest. This was not revenge. It was justice, quiet, undeniable, written in ink, and sealed in love. The humiliation was hers, not because I had forced it, but because she had built her life on a lie, and now the truth had spoken louder. As I looked around the room, I saw shame in some faces, regret in others, and in a few the faintest spark of respect they had once given me freely, before they allowed her voice to drown mine out. Now it returned, not in words, but in their gaze, their posture, the way they turned toward me as though realigning themselves with the truth they had ignored. The silence was heavy, yes, but it no longer crushed me. It crushed her. And in that weight, I finally understood the gift my wife had left behind. She had not only given me dignity, she had returned to me my voice, not as sound, but as presence. I did not need to speak, I only needed to remain. And as the silence stretched on, filling every corner, every breath, she bowed beneath it, while I sat steady. The shift in the room was complete. When the lawyer's voice fell silent at last, the room remained suspended in a stillness too heavy for words to break. Papers lay on the table, but they no longer felt like paper. They were weight, stone, verdict. They carried not ink, but the living presence of a woman who had seen further than all of us, who had known this moment would come. I sat unmoving, letting the truth settle in its place, while across from me she shifted, restless, brittle, her empire of confidence reduced to dust. The others kept their eyes on me now, not as a ghost, not as a relic, but as the one whose name had been spoken, whose dignity had been restored by the only voice that mattered. Slowly I rose, the chair creaked as though sighing with me, as though relieved to carry no longer the weight of silence and humiliation. My hands touched the table, not to claim it, not to press it into dominance, but simply to feel the wood, to steady myself in the truth that had at last been spoken aloud. I looked once at the pages, at the careful strokes of her signature, at the words she had written with a hand weakened by illness but stronger than arrogance. She had entrusted me with more than property, more than title. She had entrusted me with the reminder that love is not erased, that loyalty is not forgotten, that truth has a voice even beyond the grave. I did not speak to her. I did not need to. She had told me I shouldn't be there. She had spat it like judgment, certain she could erase me from the story. But the will was the answer she could never silence. It was not a document. It was her mother's final word, her mother's justice, her mother's love turned into permanence. And in its lines was the proof that I was not an intruder, not an exile, not a ghost haunting a life that had moved on. I was part of it, bound to it, written into it in a way that could never be undone. The others rose too, some awkwardly, some with downcast eyes, shame written in the curve of their shoulders. They had followed her confidence like sheep, and now they saw the cliff she had led them to. None dared to meet her gaze. They looked at me instead, hesitant, searching for the steadiness they had once leaned on, but had forgotten. And though my heart was scarred, though my silence had been long and cruel, I stood tall, not for triumph, not for revenge, but for the quiet dignity of being seen again. When I stepped toward the door, the floor beneath me felt different, solid, no longer carrying the hollow echo of exile. The handle was cool beneath my palm, but steady, certain, as though even it knew I was not leaving in defeat. Behind me, I could feel her collapse inward, trapped beneath the silence that was now hers to bear. But I did not turn. To look back would have been to gloat, and that was not what this was. This was not victory in the way battles are won. This was justice in its truest form, quiet, unshaken, written in the words of the woman who had known me best. The sunlight outside was softer than I expected, almost gentle, laying itself across my shoulders like a benediction. I breathed it in, deeper than I had in months, as though my lungs were finally free of the stones I had carried. I walked forward, not quickly, not slowly, but with the steady rhythm of a man who had endured, who had been cut down and yet had risen, not by his own hand, but by the truth of love preserved. She had said I shouldn't be there, but the final word belonged not to her, not to me, but to the one voice she could never silence. My wife had spoken, and her echo would outlast every cruel dismissal, every attempt to erase me. I was not just there, I belonged, and no one, not silence, not arrogance, not even betrayal, could take that away again.